Author event. Cecile Richards discusses her book, Make Trouble, Standing Up, Speaking Out, and Finding the Courage to Lead.
All these folks have been waiting long enough, so I think that we should just hop into our conversation.
Awesome.
It's been a week, hasn't it?
It's been a couple of years, hasn't it? I know, all the weeks seem to kind of run into each other. But yes, it has been a week. Actually, it's kind of nice to spend part of the week in Ann Arbor. We just had a great rally on University of Michigan campus. Thank you, everybody. It's good.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I just had a feeling I needed to acknowledge this past week before we hopped into our conversation.
Right. Well, it's all kind of, I think it's part and parcel of, I guess, kind of what the book is about, too. So, yeah, it's fitting that we're here tonight together.
I love that your book gives your activism origin story, a 7th grade protest of the Vietnam War. When you look back, is there a particular moment that you feel like led to your lifetime of activism?
Well, for folks who don't know me, I'm from Texas, and my parents were just against everything in Texas, everything that was happening, always. And so I do think growing up in Dallas, and I talk about, my parents were involved in politics, the farm workers movement, the civil rights movement. So I say, like, our dinner table wasn't where you ate, it was where you sorted precinct lists for whatever they were working on. And actually, my mother was at the luncheon waiting for President Kennedy in Dallas when he was shot. And that definitely affected our family. I mean, just, so being progressives, being liberals was a badge of honor, but it was also came with controversy. And so I guess for me, my first experience really kind of was that we'd moved to Austin, which for anyone in Dallas, it was like, oh my gosh, like there's hippies and there's love-ins and people are like tie-dyeing, and coming from Dallas where it was very conservative. But so that's where we got involved in the Unitarian Church, because it was like a progressive home, I guess, for folks in Austin. And I learned that there was going to be this protest of the Vietnam War. I was in 7th grade, and I was brand new at my new junior high school, and I decided to wear a black armband to school, not realizing that was like not going to be the thing everyone was doing at Westlake Junior High. And most of the kids knew each other because they'd been going to school together for many years, but the principal stopped me and called me to his office because I was wearing this armband, and I'll never forget him. I mean, that's also why I know it made a big impression. Dr. Tom Heston. I'd never even met the principal before, and he said, does your mother know what you're doing today? And I said, actually, I'm pretty sure she does. He said, well, I'm going to call her. And I mean, at that age, at 7th grade, being called to the principal's office, having your parents called was not, that was kind of scary. And the best thing that ever happened to Tom Heston is that Ann Richards was not home the day he called. So he caught timing is everything. And then he had to just let me go back to class. But it was one of those moments where I realized just the simple act of wearing a black armband as a young person got the attention of the principal. And it made me realize how much every one of us can make a difference just by small acts sometime. And then I was kind of hooked. And so then I went on to just be a kind of a troublemaker for the rest of my life. But that probably was it. And it's one of the reasons I love, I know some of my friends from Planned Parenthood are here in the audience because I see some pink t-shirts, and I love, so yeah, I'm gonna give a shout out to Planned Parenthood of Michigan and the great folks there. But it's one of the reasons I was really interested when I was at Planned Parenthood for the 12 years was investing in young people, really, like as peer educators, as young activists, because I think those early experiences, being able to speak up for yourself, having the confidence to advocate for yourself and your peers, it is those early years that kind of set you on a path. And so I'm so proud of what Planned Parenthood does here and around the country to help young people find their voice and give them the support they need to be amazing leaders. Yeah, so I'm for the youngsters.
Very cool. So in reading your book, I feel like someone could almost teach a contemporary history class based on it.
I'm not that old. I mean, I'm old, but
I said contemporary. I tried to be really careful in that
That
language.
was very kind of you. That was good. That was good.
So based on some of the milestones that you've seen, and I studied history, right? So like I look at those milestones. You know, when you were growing up in Texas, the girls couldn't play on a full court because ladies, right? You were in Texas when, as you said, when Kennedy was assassinated. Yeah. By the end of the book, you were this close to seeing a woman elected as president of the United States. And there is a photo of your mother with President Castro.
Yeah, that would be Fidel Castro, actually, yes.
So, like, my question for you is, like, having been, like, on the scene for, like, these moments, right, that you kind of think about as turning points or, like, historical moments, how does that influence the way that you think about how history is made?
Oh, wow. Well, that's, I know, I do sort of sound like Forrest Gump or something, like at the scene of the... Well, I was really lucky. I was raised by activist parents who, I mean, I remember meeting Cesar Chavez when I was just a kid because my parents were involved in the actually, I'll never forget, I think I talk about it in the book, my dad was a labor attorney, and he took me and my brother and my mom, and we drove down to South Texas to help kick off the farm workers' march to Austin. It was where they were fighting for a minimum wage because farm workers in Texas didn't have protection for a minimum wage. And I'll never forget, we drove, you know, in those days, you know, you didn't have air conditioning. You were driving the station wagon. It took a million years to get there, way down south. And we got there, and there was this sort of dusty hall. I think it was like a Knights of Columbus, or, you know, and they hung up the, you know, colored lights, and there was a conjunto band, and people were two-stepping around, and it was like this incredible celebration to send the farm workers off on this march to Austin. And I'm returning to my dad and saying, you know, this is my first dance. And so it was a very magical childhood in some ways of being part of people making history. And that's part of what I try to write about in the book, is that making trouble is a real privilege. And I've led a very privileged life. I always got to choose what I did for a living, and to see people who had made choices also to challenge authority, to fight for women's rights, for farm workers' rights, for LGBTQ rights, whatever it is something that has been just a part of my life. And you know, I talk about in the book, I started out as a union organizer when I left college, and lived in New Orleans, Louisiana, to organize hotel workers, mainly women of color who earn the minimum wage. And I learned then from those years, and then I went on to organize janitors and nursing home workers, that here are women who had literally nothing to fall back on. They didn't have two nickels to rub together. And yet they were willing to risk everything to fight for just a little bit better life for them and their families. And I thought, well, if these women who have all this that they're carrying are able to risk everything to fight for a better world, then what am I doing? And I feel like those are the women I have carried with me my entire life. It's like women I'll never forget. Georgia Landry, you know, Schlesinger Nursing Home in Beaumont, Texas. I could go through the list. And to me, that's, I hope, and I continue to learn, is like, what it means for those of us who can do anything. These women had really very few options about what they could do for a living. And those of us who do have options should do the very most we can to do the very most good we can. And so that is kind of a long-winded answer, and I don't remember what your original question was, but it's what it's what I think about, and I guess it's why I wrote this book, is that I think we're all called upon, particularly in these days, to do more than we ever thought we could. And I also try to write about the fact that to do that is a life actually not of drudgery and pain and suffering. It's a life of enormous joy and privilege, and you meet the most amazing people along the way.
Okay. So your mother, Ann Richards, first woman governor of Texas, lost the governorship to George W. Bush as a part of the same wave that led to Republican control of Congress during the Clinton administration. Yep. How does that experience shape your reading of current events?
Okay, so first I just have to go, because you're a historian and we want to have historical accuracy. It's really important. So Mom, yeah, she wasn't the first woman governor, okay? So back in the day, there was a governor, Paul Ferguson, okay? And he was indicted for selling pardons to the jail. So when they indicted Paul and they sent him to jail, I mean, they indicted him and kicked him out of office, his wife replaced him, and his name was Paul, so what do you think her name was? Ma, exactly. So Ma Ferguson was, in fact, the first woman elected governor of Texas. I think they used to say 2 for the price of 1. But one of the reason why Ma Ferguson is important in our history is that at the time there was controversy over over kids speaking Spanish and whether or not they were going to have bilingual education in the state of Texas. And Ma Ferguson said she was against it because if the English language was good enough for Jesus Christ, it was good enough for the school children of Texas, right? There we go. So I'm telling you, so we've always been on the cutting edge in Texas. So, but you're right. But then Mom was elected many years later. And actually, I love this story too. So when my mother's grandmother was alive, of course, women didn't have the right to vote in Texas. In fact, under Texas law, it was, quote, idiots, imbeciles, the insane, and women were denied the franchise. I know. And it hasn't been that long. But then just 2 generations later, Mom was elected governor of Texas. And so I guess my lesson in all that is that you can't win unless you run, and that the way change happens is from the ground up. Because when Mom was elected, no one thought she was going to get elected. It wasn't like, to be candid, the Democratic Party was knocking on her door saying, we really think it's time for a progressive woman governor to run the state of Texas. That did not happen. She had a very tough primary running against 2 men. I talk about some of the challenges of that. And then, of course, she was supposed to get defeated by Clayton Williams, who was, well, listen to this, see if this sounds familiar. He was a businessman who refused to show his taxes. He'd never been in office, and he made jokes about rape. And so, I know, so in some ways, well, anyway, history repeats itself. But anyway, she wasn't supposed to beat Clayton Williams, but she did. And the only reason she did, in my opinion, was because this incredible outpouring of women, of LGBTQ folks who had never been able to serve openly in Texas government, farm workers, teachers, students, African-American leaders came together, and we turned out people that had never been turned out in the state of Texas, and she won, and she barely won. And so that, to me, that lesson, I feel like I just saw reenacted in 2018, which is where right. I mean, it is because, you can look at people across this country. One of my favorite ones, Lauren Underwood. If you don't know her, you need to know her, okay? Congresswoman from Illinois. She beat 6 men in her primary, right? I mean, no one said, Lauren, it's your time, right? She beat them, and then she went on to win the general election against an incumbent. She's the youngest African-American woman ever to serve in the United States Congress, and she is going places, right? So to me, what we saw, right, so let's give it up for Lauren and all these amazing folks. I think that this whole idea that you have to do things the way they've always been done has been turned on its head, and I think it was turned on its head in 2018. Not only by this historic number of women and women of color being elected to Congress, but of people making historic races like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who absolutely changed the electorate in the state of Georgia. And if we had counted every vote in Georgia and everyone had been allowed to vote, she would be governor today, right? And so it is, it's old. I mean, that was a long time ago when Mom ran, but the lessons are still true. Is if you invest in organizing and you invest in people, and you welcome people into the process, you can change history. And I think that's what we're fixing to do in 2020 as well. I really do. Yeah.
In reading your book, I am stricken by how strongly family is woven into your story. You talk a lot about how the different generations of your family have supported each other. You talk about the different ways that your husband, Kirk, has been super supportive. That's really fun to read about, by the way.
He came out so well. I swear to God. It's been, I know. I feel like all those years of putting up with me was worth it for him to get in this book. Yeah, it's just like, yeah.
So you are clearly very connected to your family, and it's also super clear that you've had a extremely active and productive career. With those things in mind, what advice would you give to parents who both want the best world for their children to inherit, but also want to do what's best for their children in the moment?
Right. Well, I know this is a question that comes up a lot, but first I'll say, I mean, it is kind of funny. I mean, things change. So, I mean, even when Mom ran for governor, like right now, if you're going to run for governor of a big state like Texas, you have professional people come and run your campaign. You've got like, okay, she had me and Kirk and our family. And it was almost like a Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland kind of like, okay, we're going to hang up a curtain and like we can do this. And so those days have somewhat gone, but it was true. It was like a family thing. And so I think that in some ways my experience probably isn't repeated that often. In fact, I always when I talk to candidates and campaigns, and I like it, if your brother-in-law is running your campaign, you got to like really rethink what you're doing. But I do think that I have 3 kids. I talk about them a lot in the book. I love my kids. I'm really close to them. We have had hilarious adventures together, many of them on campaigns. And I guess I just believe that kids, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have had the same experience. I don't think kids, they don't learn from what they hear you say. They learn from what they see you do. And for me, in a way, I think right now, I remember actually being kind of frustrated when my kids were in college. It's like, what are you fighting for? Like, why aren't you guys like chaining yourselves to the administration office? And because I felt like there was this sort of period where kids weren't as active and challenging us. And so I feel like that one of the things that's important right now, if for people who don't agree with things our government's doing, whether it's about women, whether it's about LGBTQ people, whether it's about people of different religions, whether it's about separating families at the border, there's never been a better time to show your kids how it's all together. And I mean, I am so inspired by seeing parents bringing their young kids to rallies and to marches. And I remember this 11-year-old girl who came to a book talk I did in Nashville and with her mom. And she said in a question like, I'm 11 years old, what should I do? And of course, everyone in the audience yelled, run for class president, So I think this is a moment in which not to think of these things as separate. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I just met with a woman yesterday in Livonia who's running an organization. She's got 11-year-old triplets, and like she's just going and blowing. And I'm sure her triplets are learning a lot along the way about what really is important to her. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's my only advice is bring them along for the ride. I mean, I talk about my story like I was organizing Central American janitors in LA when my first daughter Lily was born. And so I just like put her on the backpack and then would take her to the buildings, because we had to talk to folks at their dinner break at 9 p.m. And so Lily learned from an early age. And she had to go home with one of my coworkers when I was arrested for protesting to get the janitors a contract. And she's never forgotten it. So anyway, it all works out.
Okay. There were a lot of things that really struck me as I was reading your book, but one of them was this idea that you expressed, that parenting isn't for everyone and that you would fight with your last breath to protect anyone's right to make the decision as to whether or not they want to be parents. Of course, when people think about Planned Parenthood, mm-hmm. You think about birth control, abortion comes to mind. One of the things that's impacted the way that I think about abortion mm-hmm. services is actually parenthood.
Yep.
And some of those difficult hours, like, there have been times where I found myself thinking, like, how could somebody make somebody do this? Mm-hmm. Right. Like, I want to be doing this, but right now, Like, I don't understand, like in those moments, it's like, I don't understand how somebody can sentence, I guess, somebody to that. Aging has also impacted the way that I think about abortion services, right? Like, you're younger, or for me anyway, I'll use an I statement, speak for myself. You're younger, you think about it a certain way. You get toward the other end of your reproductive life and think about like complications and things that could come with.
Right. Right.
What do you wish that people thought more about when they thought about abortion services?
Well, I guess not just abortion services, but just reproductive health care in general is, it's sort of none of your business what someone else does with their body. And it's really, I mean, and yes, it's, I have 3 kids. I also had an abortion, and I talk about it publicly because I think it's important for those of us who can just make that statement unapologetically. Say it was a decision that, thank goodness, I could make for myself. And now I actually have to recognize in the state of Texas, it's a lot harder to make that decision than it was even when I was younger. But I agree. I mean, being a parent has been the most amazing thing of my life. I mean, I feel like if everything else sort of falls to pieces, these 3 people that are part of my life are so important. And we could all wax on about our kids, so I won't. But if you want to ask me any questions about them, I'd love to tell you more. But I do think it also, yes, you're not ever not a parent again. And I think that's one of the things that is like I really learned at Planned Parenthood is like how important it is for people to be able to make these decisions. And of course, ironically, and I will just have to point out that in the state of Alabama, the vote to outlaw legal abortion was made by basically people who will never be pregnant. And I think that's important to remember, right? That it is, I wish what we had more of in this country was empathy. And that to me is, and actually, it's kind of, I think this is kind of interesting. I just, with some other women, just started a new organization called Supermajority. And it's been really interesting that we did it's connected. But we actually asked, we just started about 2-3 weeks ago now, and we asked folks to say what their superpower was. We had 58,000 people in the first week actually fill out a survey about like what issues they cared about, what they hoped for the world, and the number one superpower trait that they listed was empathy, which I think is a real statement about what we want to see in our government and what we want to see in our world and what we know we're capable of as human beings. And I learned so many, of all the years at Planned Parenthood is that no one can ever be in another person's situation, never really know what's going on with them. And the most important thing we can do is trust women, trust pregnant people to make the decisions that are the best for them, and be there to provide the health care that they need. Yeah.
So I'm glad that you mentioned the organization Supermajority.
Yeah.
I'm so curious. What can you tell us about it?
Well, it was partly came out of, and I write about it in this, I think the addendum of I just sort of felt like we had done all this amazing work at Planned Parenthood, and we provide health care to millions of people, have been on the front lines along with others to make sure we protected insurance coverage, birth control, access, all these other things. But I also knew that there were a lot of other issues that women were concerned about. The fact that we are the only developed country with no mandated paid family leave. It's incredible, that we have no child care plan in America. And you can talk to pretty much anybody who's had to deal with child care, including a lot of the women I talked to in Michigan today. Child care is now the second biggest cost for so many families, and we have literally no plan on how to deal with it. The fact that women still make 80 cents on the dollar, but that's if you're a white woman. If you're a woman of color, for African American women, it's about 63 cents. For Latinas, it's 54 cents on the dollar. That's an outrage. This is like a national economic crisis. And so I just feel like it's time for us to organize. Women are now, actually we're 54% of the electorate, the voters in the last election, which is one of the reasons I think things changed so much. We're the volunteers. We're increasingly the donors to campaigns. We're the candidates for campaigns. And yet, yeah, I know. It's like, okay, there's a trend here. And yet we have very little political power. I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think we now rank 76th in the world for women's political representation, right behind Somalia. Okay? Yeah. So there's work to do. And so really the idea of supermajority, which I was really excited to co-found with my friend Alicia Garza, who was one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Ai-jen Poo, who is the head of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, who works with caregivers, who are predominantly women of color. And so we launched Supermajority about 3 weeks ago now to try to figure out how can we provide the support and training and amplification of the incredible work that women are doing, and also lift up an agenda for like a women's New Deal, right? That's what we need in this country. We need an agreement that women are equal parts of society, and they should be equal parts of our economy, and they should be treated equally in government, in our culture, and in business. And if we do that, it's good for women, it's good for families, it's good for communities, it's good for the country. And so particularly in this presidential year coming up, I don't want to just know where Elizabeth Warren stands on childcare, but I'm so excited that she introduced a very, laid out a very comprehensive. I want to know where everyone is on childcare, right? Every single person running. And so I think there is an opportunity to lift these issues up and organize millions of people, not only women, but anyone who cares about gender equity in America. I think it's time to quit talking about it and time to do something about it. So that's the idea of supermajority. So you can find us. Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess the obvious point is it's just an exciting time to be an organizer. And I think
Have you found a time that you have felt like it
wasn't an exciting time? Well, I think the funny thing is, and maybe you guys can relate to this, is that, there's times when you're trying to call attention to a problem and you're trying to say, really, we need to do something about this. I feel like right now it's the opposite problem. It is, and that's what I have felt like, even going around the country on book tour, they were not like book events, they were like tent revivals. It's just like, you put out the bat signal and women are just coming out and going, okay, now what are we supposed to do? Because I think, folks marched, they rushed to defend Planned Parenthood access, they've defended people at airports and on the border, and now they're saying, okay, but what more can we do? And so it's a really different challenge for organizers. It's now not, how do we get people to feel like they need to do something? It's actually, how do we deal with this tsunami of people that are saying, we want to change the direction of this country? And that to me it's a really exciting opportunity, but it's not like, it hasn't always been that way. Here's a crazy statistic. The Kaiser Foundation estimates that since the last election, 1 in 5 Americans have marched or taken part in a protest. It's amazing, right? It's historic. And the number one issue has been women's rights. So that's a lot of people. And if we could just, as my colleague Amanda Brown-Lehrman says, we can get them information and get them information. we can do something big. And I think it's going to be interesting because, I know I just sort of mentioned Alabama. I think that the issue of safe and legal abortion access in this country is going to be an enormous issue in this election because it's no longer an academic question. I think with the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh, with the, with what we're seeing in state after state, a right that people have had in this country for more than 40 years, I think is absolutely at risk. And it's important that we talk to folks about it. And supermajority will work on more than reproductive issues for sure. But I do think that this is a really important time for us to say as a country, where do we stand? Are we going to go basically 50 years backwards, or are we going to make progress? Yeah.
I recently had the privilege to hear Valerie Jarrett speak about her own book.
Yeah.
And she, I felt like when I read your book, I heard a similar theme. And that theme is that individuals speaking out matters. Both of you talked about public response to the ACA being repealed. And I just wonder what you feel the lessons are in that public response for us.
Okay, well, this was crazy. So I don't know if y'all remember, but the day after the election, well, you probably do remember the day after the election, and a lot of people I know were like, hiding under the covers. People say, I couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks, I couldn't quit crying. Well, one thing I will say is that Planned Parenthood, that was not an option, because people were waiting for us the next day. And I really just have to give a shout out to, the clinicians and the escorts and the folks who just continue to do that work no matter what, right? But I do talk about in this story, because it was a story which was really important. So we had lost the presidency, the Congress, and we knew, because Paul Ryan had said, then Speaker Paul Ryan, now retired Speaker Paul Ryan, had said, we are going to, the first thing up is going to be repealing the Affordable Care Act and defunding Planned Parenthood. And so there was no question that was what, in fact, I remember being on Rachel Maddow, and Rachel said, what are you going to do? Looking at me like, okay, now what's your plan? And I said, well, we're going to fight this, and we're going to organize people in this country. And she said, well, I don't think she basically said, good luck, I don't think it's going to work. And I've never reminded her of that, but I'd like to go back and say, but no, because I love her. But and of course, then we were scrambling. We're trying to figure out how to defend Planned Parenthood. I talk about in my book about a really bizarre meeting with Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, who wanted to make a deal on about, I don't know, that if we would quit providing abortion services, that Jared Kushner would somehow get some more money from Congress for Planned Parenthood. And I said, well, that is not going to happen. So that plan isn't going to work. But we had to really go into battle. And the incredible thing is, the moment that Paul Ryan said we're going to defund Planned Parenthood, I mean, it was like women just lit up the congressional switchboard, and they never quit. And in fact, I mean, as you probably remember, members of Congress were canceling town hall meetings left and right, because there was women in pink pussy hats and pitchforks waiting for them everywhere. There was a great episode in Denver, actually, a congressman who actually also is no longer in Congress, literally running out the back door of a public meeting because he didn't want to face folks, and because people were agitated and organized. But people didn't give up. We didn't have the votes. We didn't have the votes in Congress. We didn't have the votes in the United States Senate. But people just kept going. And then, of course, I remember one of my favorite moments was there was something called Trump Care. I don't know if you remember Trump Care. That was their alternative. And I remember I was at the Capitol. They were trying to get the final deals done on Trump Care. We were over there talking to members of Congress, and they had invited the Freedom Caucus to go over to meet at the White House to get the final details. And I'm thinking, and one of the final agreements was that they would get rid of maternity benefits. And that would be part of the way they, got the votes they needed. Okay, that's maternity benefits, right? And so I'm sitting there in the Capitol thinking, if I could just get a photograph of the room of people that just negotiated away maternity care, because I know it's all men. And wouldn't you know it, Mike Pence himself tweeted out a photograph of them that very moment. It was amazing. So of course that lit up the internet, and then someone did one of my favorite all-time memes was of golden retrievers sitting around an oval table negotiating feline health care. And it was but I mean, that was really kind of the tenor of the whole thing. But as you probably all remember, and you can get into all the bloody story in the book, is that that night when we're all at the Capitol waiting for the vote, and Senator Patty Murray says, Cecile, we don't have the votes. We can't, we've gotten Susan Collins, we got Lisa Murkowski, and then John McCain made his famous thumbs down sign, and we were saying, that's right. And this is what's important to remember, though, because John McCain gets a lot of credit for that, and God rest his soul, I'm glad he took that vote. But if the women in the United States Senate and the Democratic caucus hadn't stayed together, and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski hadn't, that would have never been possible. And so I think it's really important to remember that organizing works. And it was the fact that people never gave up and never gave in. That's why Planned Parenthood's doors are still open today. So thank you all to you who did your part in making that possible. I guess that's one of the things I've learned all this over these years is if you're a progressive, it's true. You lose, and then you win, and it's all worth it. I have a few other stories where those came from. So anyway, yeah.
I found myself thinking about your line of work and safety when I was reading your book. When you talk about the murder of George Tiller, Kansas doctor who provided abortion services, who, by the way, was shot in his church. I've thought about all the ways that walking around in a woman's body can feel vulnerable, and then I thought about like the kind of work that you do, right? That kind of amplifies that, right? Just because of the target nature of being a spokesperson for something that people feel very strongly about and demonstrate that, right? So what do you do to feel safe as you're doing the work that you do?
Well, one thing I just want to dispel, which is for every one person who comes up to me and gives me some kind of tract they want me to read or says something ugly, there are 99 people who come up to me and say, thank you for what Planned Parenthood does. Thank you for the health care you provide. And so I just, and I won't get into the George Tiller story because I write about it in the book, but there were some really important things that happened out of that, I think actually even in the movement, and he was an incredible man. But I just think it's easy sometimes to focus on, well, let me back up. We got to quit focusing on the people who want to tear us down and focus instead on the people who are counting on us every day. And that is actually how I get through. And I talk about in the book about, testifying before Congress, before this really hostile committee. And that was, I think, actually my lesson from that, which was I could sit there and focus on these men with like veins popping out of their forehead, finger pointing and mansplaining to me, or I could focus on the millions of women around the country who I feel like I was there, that they didn't have the chance to be there. They didn't have the chance to tell their story and why they needed access to reproductive health care and affordable health care. And so I just think sometimes we just have to change who we're focused on and don't read the comment section on Twitter. I think that's like a really important tool. But I remember my favorite memory actually out of that hearing was in the middle of it, and it was really ugly for any of you who lost some hours of your life having to watch it. But in the middle of it, my son Daniel texted me, and he's always kind of the hero in some of my stories, but Daniel texts me and he writes, Mom, I'm so proud of you. You're doing such a great job. I'm watching you on TV. He said, I think raising me all those years really helped you prepare for this hearing today.
Was he right?
Yeah, he was actually 100% right. Being a mom in general probably helped prepare. But it's funny, I also learned on that is like, if you didn't get down in the gutter with them, if you didn't actually, I realized at some point, they just want me to get angry back at them because that's actually what feeds them. And if you just sort of don't, then they get really mad, right? And so it's sort of, and I also learned an important lesson that day, which is if someone's making an idiot of themselves on national television, sometimes you just let them keep the microphone, right? You just kind of have to watch it all play out, but don't stoop down to their level, and don't focus on them because they're not the ones that matter. The ones that matter are the folks that are out there that you're in, that I think you're in allegiance with. So anyway, that's how I focus on it. But I also just feel you can't live your life scared.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Well, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
Right? So, but I also want to say thank you to all the good folks at Planned Parenthood, the escorts, the security people who keep our patients and our doctors safe, because that work is really, really important. Yeah.
So I first want to remind people, if you have questions, this will be a really good time to raise your hand so people can get those cards up, because we're getting pretty close to your turn to ask the questions. But I'm going to ask you, what should I have asked you today that I totally skipped?
Oh my God, well there's so many, no, you've actually done a fabulous job. You're a great interviewer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Really. I guess, just ask me about my kids. That's really all I really...
Tell us a really embarrassing story about your. No, I'm joking.
Well, there's a lot of those, and they've. No, but I think it's. Look, I think it. I was a union organizer for a long time before I had kids, and I still can't believe that I had so little idea of what parents and what women deal with, like raising children. I feel like having kids kind of has grounded me. But also is important. I think you have to teach your kids life skills, and if you come from Texas, that includes being able to deep fry because it's a dying art in this world. Being able to make a pie crust from scratch, and being able to fry a tortilla, and that once they did that, I felt like they were ready to go away from home. So they've all been very successful, since then. Yeah.
All right. Let me see here. So I'm gonna get into the audience questions.
Okay.
One of them is this: I'm glad that you acknowledge privilege in your upbringing. Now, how do we effectively involve or empower the less privileged?
I mean, I think there's so many ways. I think part of it is being aware that your experience is not the same as everyone else's, and that sometimes takes a while. And then, but to me, most importantly now is looking around the rooms that you're in and seeing who's missing and making room and inviting them in and then giving them the mic. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, I think that's true for all kinds of folks who've been left out of the process. Mm-hmm. I think so. Like one of the things I do now is if I'm going to be on a speaking panel, or I want to see who else is on the panel. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to be on any more panels with all white women in my life. That's just not going to happen. And I mean, that's like a small thing. That's not even, and it's really interesting. In fact, I said this the other day. I was at a thing where the crowd was all men, and I kind of said the same thing, which is, if you serve on a board, and a lot of those guys did, or you are asked to be part of some kind of presentation, look around. Mm-hmm. And sometimes maybe you need to say, you know what, actually, I'm not the person you need. You need somebody else on here, and I'm going to help you find that person. Or look at the board and say, if there's not diversity on that board, maybe you're taking up someone else's spot. Mm-hmm. And so I just think that because I think sometimes fixing all the problems we have around race and class are overwhelming, but I do think once we begin to actually take small actions ourselves, the ripples occur. Mm-hmm. And now it's really interesting to me when I am asked, it's very seldom now that people haven't already thought, okay, I better look at what this room's going to look like, who the people are going to be there. That was important to me on book tour as well. And so I think there are things that we can do to just make sure that there's room. And also, I mean, everything gets better when you actually diversify who's part of the discussion and part of the solution. So I hope that's what we're doing at Supermajority. I think there's something each of us can do in our work life, in our social life, in our advocacy world.
Okay. I'm going to kind of ask you a pair of questions. I kind of see these as bookends. Perhaps you will too, or you won't, and you'll tell me all about it. So bookend A is this. As a 12-year-old boy in public school, how can I stand up for feminism and abortion rights?
Okay, can we just give it up for whoever the 12-year-old boy is? Like that is.
And then the other end is where
stand up. Can you stand up? Sorry to out you there, but I'm so proud of you.
And then the other question is this one. Where does one find bravery later in life? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, so my 12-year-old friend here, I think that there's nothing as impactful about standing up for others who are in situations that you may never be in yourself. And that is, so if you can learn that at 12 years old, you will change the world. And it's interesting, I think for guys now, and it's something so I know you're 12, but this is something older men can learn as well, is I was actually at a university the other day talking to a young guy who was saying, like, what can I do? And I said, well, when a woman actually stands up in class and says, you know what, I think something's not right, or I feel like I haven't been treated right, then don't wait for another woman to stand up and support her. You can support her. And I can't tell you how powerful that is when people of whether it's across gender, across race, across experience, stand up with each other and ask for that person who maybe isn't heard to be heard. It changes the whole dynamic. And and it's just awesome that you're thinking about it, because if you're thinking about it, you're going to find those opportunities every day. And so I think that is what we can all do, even older in life, because we haven't all gotten it right? I feel like every day I'm learning things about privilege and things I did wrong. And so I think the most important thing is to be able to learn and grow and be around people who actually challenge you, who make you, and you don't have to be defensive about it. It's like, in some ways, maybe we were doing the best we could, but it wasn't good enough. There were things I did at Planned Parenthood, which I now think, I wish I'd done that a different way. I wish I'd said that a different way. I wish I'd known what I know now. So there's nothing bad about that. It's actually, that's how we grow, and that's how we become more empathetic and more, and sort of build our common humanity. And boy, if there were ever time in this country when we have to just get back to some core values about humanity, about all people, and we need not just young people to do that. I mean, the stuff that's happening right now in America, it's on all of us. There's nobody that gets a pass. But if you really want to get courageous, I guess then to maybe answer that better, is if you want to find courage and you can't find it yourself, hang out with young people like our 12-year-old friend. That will give you courage and inspiration, okay?
This question is, I've wanted to run for office as a 23-year-old.
Do it right now. That's I don't care what the rest of the question is, okay?
How do I rally when I don't have the connections?
It doesn't matter. And that's that's my Lauren Underwood story, okay? Or Lucy McBath. Lucy McBath, right? I'm telling you, from Georgia. Her son was murdered. And it was through that process that she learned how broken the criminal justice system is. She didn't have any connections. She became involved in fixing criminal justice. She ran for Congress in a seat that is a majority Anglo seat that was actually held by an anti-choice leader. And Lucy McBath won her election, and she's now in Congress. And so I think it's the exciting thing to me is that I think a lot of the new folks coming into Congress are sort of pulling back the curtain and demystifying what it means to run for office. So if you know how to talk to people, if you know how to listen to people, you can run for office. And I actually feel like when people think, it's funny, I used to work for Ms. Pelosi, and people used to always come through wanting to run for office, and she said, don't tell me how much money you got. Don't tell me how many big wigs you know. Tell me, are there 500 people that live in your area that care about you being in office and that will come with you on this journey? And if you have that, I'm going to back you all the way. Mm-hmm. And so just think about that. And I think if we had more people that were running for office who were good listeners rather than good talkers, we would have a different kind of politics in America.
Someone asks you, how do I know if I'm on the wrong side of history or not progressive enough?
Oh, wow. How do you know if you're on the, well, I mean, I guess none of us really know about what will happen next, but I think we know what will happen if we don't do anything, so I'm just going to lay that out there, okay? And then I think it's important that people feel that they have the power to actually change the course of history. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's, we don't have all the answers. None of us do. But the only way we actually, I think, get better is be in rooms where people are actually having conversations about what they hope and dream for. And to me, it is one of the reasons that we started this new organization, because I do think it's important to not just resist things we don't like, although I want to give it up for folks who have been doing that. But it's really important, too, to actually agree together as a people, what is the world we want to live in? What would a world of real equality mean? And recognize that means for a lot of us giving up some power, maybe giving up some space. It's one of the reasons I left Planned Parenthood after 12 years. Is like, you know what? I can't just be investing in young people and in people of color and then just sit on top of this organization for the rest of my life. It's time I make space and move over and let somebody else have what I think is, frankly, the best job in the United States of America, and that's being president of Planned Parenthood. So sometimes it's also just looking around and saying, am I taking up too much room myself? And making room for other folks.
How do we encourage men to be involved in the fight for reproductive freedom?
First we're going to follow our 12-year-old friend here. And look, I think that one of the exciting things that's happening is that, and obviously we've seen a lot of this out in the world, is that, a lot of women, a lot of pregnant people have been talking about their own abortion stories, have been talking about why it was important to be able to make these decisions. I think it's important for men to talk about that too, and how access to safe and legal abortion in this country has changed their lives and how much they stand up for these as well. I'm tired of us just telling our own stories. Okay, so men, tell your story, right? Just get out there and, because all the issues we're talking about, they're not women's issues. They are fundamental issues of human rights. And so I think sometimes I feel like we need the 5-point plan, just like the little pocket notebook you could give every man and say, if you're looking to do more, so maybe at supermajority we might just create that. Because I do think there are men who can do more and want to do more, and sometimes we just have to sort of lead the way or give them some pointers. But look, I appreciate it. The fact that, it's interesting, even when we started supermajority, 25% of the folks who joined, and we had more than almost 90,000 people join in the first couple of weeks, almost 25% are folks who don't identify as a woman or don't use the she, her pronouns. And so that means there's a lot of other folks out here in the world that believe in equality. So anyway, I want to thank all the men that came in the audience tonight, right? Talking about a women's book. So thank you. That's showing up. That's 99% of life.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a shift. What do you think that unions in our country should be doing to regain strength?
Well, I think I was a labor organizer. I believe in unions. I believe that's why we have a middle class. I believe that's why we have an 8-hour day and why we have weekends, right? So we should give it up for the labor movement for actually having changed life in America. And I think we have to think about different ways of organizing workers now. Our economy's changed and our organizing methods haven't necessarily changed. But I will just really, I do want to acknowledge the work that SEIU kind of was in the lead on, but a lot of us other have joined in. But a few years ago, the thought of a $15 an hour minimum wage was people thought everyone was crazy, right? Actually to propose it. And now it's actually going across the country. So I think actually thinking about the ways in which we can reduce the inequality in this country by having not only, living wages for folks, but then also, of course, building in what we have to, which is how do we address childcare? How do we make sure that healthcare is actually not a privilege in this country, but it's a right? These are fundamental issues that I think will change, maybe not through a traditional labor union organizing construct, but when we are fighting for everyone to have an equal access to those basic fundamental human rights, that's how I think we're going to change the country. And again, it's not that we don't know how to do it, it's we haven't built the political will in America to do it. And I think we're on the verge of doing that. But I really do want to acknowledge what the labor movement has done, because every one of us, even if we're not in a union, has benefited from their work. Okay. Yeah.
So I think that we have time for one more.
Okay.
And so the question that I'm going to ask you is,
my
which
favorite
of you-
my favorite pie? No one asked me.
well, it's because we stalk you online and know the answer.
Oh. Okay.
But you should tell everybody. Cherry.
Oh, good. Yeah. I make an incredible cherry pie. I'm just gonna lay it. I don't like to brag, but in this case, it's the truth.
Oh, maybe you answered my final question.
Oh dear.
'Cause the final
Okay. That's my
question
secret. Yeah, my secret.
is, which of your accomplishments are you most proud of?
No, that's. But also, I'm the crust department. 100% butter. Okay. I'm just gonna say it right there. It's just like that's the only way to go. Okay, that's a good question, and I'll end with this. Well, one, of course, my kids, because they're amazing, and I love them, and so that's, I guess, a real accomplishment. But in the world of like organizing work and what I've spent my career doing was the day, actually, when we passed the Affordable Care Act, and it was so controversial, and as you remember, it almost didn't pass, and I write about in this, my book, all the controversy we had over covering things like maternity care. But the last big fight was, of course, over birth control, which is insane. Like, everyone uses birth control. It's very popular. Guys like it. Everyone likes it. And but we had to wage a major campaign at Planned Parenthood and with other colleagues. I mean, we had like people coming to Congress. We had, young people dressing up in gigantic birth control packs on college campuses all across America and lobbying the White House. And it was never a done deal, but I'll never forget the day that President Obama called me at Planned Parenthood and said he was about to announce there at in the Rose Garden that from now on birth control would be covered for all people, no matter where they worked, no matter what kind. And it has revolutionized access to birth control in this country. And that is something that people fought decades to do. And I just felt so honored and privileged to get to be there at the moment when we finally made that happen. And now, 72 million people in this country have access to no-cost birth control and with the lowest rate of teenage pregnancy in the history of the United States of America. So that, to me, anyway, that was worth it. Yeah, to you, to all of you. So thank you. This has been so fun to get to meet you. I want to I want to make sure we thank the Ann Arbor District Library for having us tonight, and I want to thank my friends at Planned Parenthood of Michigan, which I did, and so many of them are in the audience, and I want to thank Literati Bookstore for sponsoring. So anyway, thank you, and Sherlonya for being such a great interviewer. Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot.
This program was recorded on May 21st, 2019 at the Ann Arbor District Library.